very welcome to be here at Rockefeller University. We're very excited to have you and very excited to have 4 exceptional panelists who are going to tell us about the long-term implications of gene editing. This event has been organized by the Science and Education Policy Association, SIPA. We are a society that's sponsored by Weill Cornell, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and Rockefeller University. We're only a year old, and our goals are to engage the community in policy issues, to empower scientists to effectively engage in policymaking, and to advocate science policy career options. And although we're only 1 year old, we've already organized quite a few things here in the city in collaboration with multiple organizations such as the Atlantic Council, Science Today, Research America, or the Young Turks. So Avatar is now going to tell you a bit more about how we fit into the global science policy landscape in New York City.
Hey everybody, because I'm more familiar with some recent events that have been going on, jumping in. Before I continue, a brief shout out to the institutes in the Tri-I that have been giving us funding for the past year and have been helping us and put this event together. So just to be brief, I'm assuming since you are here, you follow the news, or as a correlation, and you might have been following what's been happening in the past week or so. Some groups have been popping up around New York, and so we're really excited to start collaborating with these groups. And so in addition to SIPA, you also have SCAN and NYU, who does grassroots coordination between scientists and other NGOs in the city. And then also within the past 2 weeks, the Columbia University Science Policy Group popped up over at Columbia. And so if anybody's interested in working with us or with other groups, we are looking to expand. We have a whole bunch of projects we're interested in pursuing, so feel free to reach out to us afterwards. For today's event, just as a quick shout out to the groups that have been working with us on this specific event. One is the Atlantic Council, and the other is the Science Communications and Media Group here at Rockefeller University. This is a student and postdoctoral group that allows people who are interested in engaging in some form of science communication, reaching out to the public. We'll be following more events in the near future. Also, our volunteers, Sarah, Johannes, Wabu, Allison, and Lola.
So we are really excited to have our panelists today. Let me introduce you Marnie Gelbart. She's the Director of Programs at Personal Genetics Education Project from Harvard University. Marnie leads professional development trainings and classroom workshops for teachers and students. And some additional work includes organizing congressional briefings and work with television writers and producers in conjunction with Hollywood. She's also one of the authors of the interactive online tool MapED. Robbie Barbero. Until recently, Robbie was an Assistant Director for Biological Innovation at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he developed and implemented policy on a wide range of global and national life science issues, including Obama's Brain Initiative, novel nutrient production platforms, genome editing, developing world cancer diagnosis, and biotechnology and regulatory policy. Beforehand, from 2012 and 2013, he was a AAA Science and Technology Fellow. Matthew Liao, he's the Director of the Center for Bioethics in New York University. Beforehand, from 2006 to 2009, he was Deputy Director and James Martin Senior Research Fellow in the program of the Ethics of of the New Bioscience in the Faculty of Philosophy at Oxford University. He's the author of several books, including The Right to Be Loved, Moral Brains, The Neuroscience of Morality, Philosophical Foundation of Human Rights, and over 50 articles in philosophy and bioethics. His work has been featured in numerous magazines, including the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. And finally, Jamie Metzl. He's a writer and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Jamie's focus is on technology and national security. Previous positions include Executive Vice President of the Asia Society, Director of Multilateral and Humanitarian Affairs of the National Security Council, and Senior Advisor of the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs during the Clinton administration. He's also the author of 2 science fiction thrillers, called Genesis Code, a thriller of the near future, and the Eternal Sonata, a thriller of the near future. So Jamie will give us some introductory remarks of the topic, and he will moderate our debate today. So just to mention that we are live streaming right now. You can follow us on Twitter. We are live in Periscope. Our hashtag is FutureOfGE. And you can also follow us live streaming right now in Facebook Live. And we encourage you to share it with everyone. So join me welcoming Jamie to the stage. And once again, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for being here. Everybody who's here understands the importance of this issue, but for the rest of the world, certainly people in the United States, there are a lot of things that feel very urgent right now that we're spending a lot of time talking about. And there are things like Donald Trump. There are things like ISIS. And there are a lot of issues that when you open the newspaper, or I guess for most everyone in this room, you open your screen every morning, you have all these stories. 1, 2, 3, 4 are all about these issues that feel extremely important. And they are important because they are urgent. But 1,000 years from now, when people look back at today, they're not going to say, oh yeah, this was the age of Trump, or this was the age of terrorism, or this was the age of ISIS, or this was the age of a lot of things that feel very urgent right now. But they will say that after 4 billion years of evolution, by Darwinian principles of random mutation and natural selection, this was the time when our species took control for the first time of our evolutionary process. And it's huge, and it's almost so big that it's very difficult for people to absorb that lesson and absorb the implications of it. And one of the drivers, probably the biggest driver of this change, is that we have, particularly through sequencing the genome, we are in the process of recognizing that biology is in many ways an information technology. And we've all been socialized through our experience to understand the attributes of information technology. It's why we have an expectation that our phones will get smarter and faster, and that we understand that with the information technology, there's code. We can understand that code. We can write that code. We can hack that code. But it's very difficult after these 4 billion years of thinking one way to internalize that we are code, that we are our information technology. Biology is information technology, and so all of those attributes of IT increasingly are going to apply to us. And that's particularly difficult because our brains very logically are designed for linear thinking. If you're in the savannah, our ancestors just climbed out of trees, and you're in the savannah, and you're just kind of standing up on your tiptoes to look over the grass. If you are an exponential thinker, and you're thinking, I'm seeing over the grass, but I looked up, and what if we had helicopters that were like flying around and jet planes? Like, wouldn't that be amazing? I guarantee you're going to be the first guy who gets eaten when the saber-toothed tiger comes around. So exponential thinking is actually pretty dangerous for us based on how we've lived most of our lives. But now, given the speed of change on a J-curve, if we're not thinking exponentially, if we're looking backwards to understand the speed of change, thinking, well, what's 10 years of change? Well, a 10-year unit of change is 2007 until 2017. But that is not a 10-year unit of change of 2017 to 2027. And that is not 1x for 2027 to 2037. So the speed of change is increasing, and we're not at all ready for it. And then we put those pieces together, and when we think about, well, what is coming? It requires us to think very much like science fiction writers. And one way I like to help people kind of think about this change is that if you had a time machine and you traveled 100 years into the future, what would you see? And my guess is you would see a world where, certainly from a perspective of healthcare, what we're doing today would be the equivalent of leeches. Because we are already, everyone knows this, we're moving into an age of personalized precision medicine based on a much greater understanding of how each individual works. But now let's have fun with that time machine. So now let's go back 1,000 years into the past. And we'll go and we'll take a baby and we'll bring that baby back to today and place that baby with a family. How does that baby grow up? Exactly like anybody else. Just that you put them in a school, whatever, their brain, their bodies would be very similar to ours. But go 1,000 years into the future and take the same baby, same type of baby, different baby, I guess, and bring that child back to today, and that child would be a genetic Superman or Superwoman. Live longer, healthier, immune to diseases, higher intelligence in many ways, and would probably have lots of capabilities that right now we attribute to maybe outliers, 1 in a million, 1 in hundreds of millions of humans, or animals, or even new types of qualities that we can't even understand now based on synthetic biology. Another way of understanding this, of where we are in this moment, is that in 1865, Jules Verne wrote a story about humans landing on the moon. And it was a story. I mean, it was kind of like, now we think, well, what would it be like to travel to a star or a planet outside of our solar system? It's kind of interesting. We don't know how we would do it, but you could imagine it happening. And it was science fiction. In 1962, President Kennedy gave his famous speech in Houston saying that the United States was going to put a man on the moon within a decade. And it wasn't that he was just making stuff up. It was that the technology already existed. And the mathematics already existed. And there was just putting those pieces together to get from where they were in 1962 to where eventually we were in 1969 when Neil Armstrong made his famous one small step for man. And with the technologies that we're discussing today, this is not 1865. This is 1962. We will invent all kinds of new technologies, but we don't need them to, in the near term, transform healthcare, and in the medium to long term, potentially transform fundamental aspects of what it means to be a human being. So these are all technologies that already exist, and I'll mention 3, and we're going to talk about the third, particularly in our conversation today. So the first, as everybody knows, is IVF, in vitro fertilization, and embryo selection, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, or genetic selection, PGS. So right now, that everybody knows this, we have IVF. An average woman has about 15 eggs extracted during the typical IVF procedure. Those eggs are fertilized and then selected to go back into the mother. With PGD and PGS, there's greater scrutiny of those early stage pre-implanted fertilized eggs. And right now, based on the knowledge that we have of the genome, it's the things that we can test for, as you know, it's gender, it's eye color, it's hair color, and it's about 4,000 single gene mutation diseases, so-called Mendelian diseases. But we are very quickly moving to a space where the cost of sequencing the genome is moving towards negligibility. You all know that at the end in 2003, at the end of the Human Genome Project, it had taken more than a decade and cost around $1 billion to sequence the first genome. Now it costs about $1,000 and takes a few days, but very, very shortly it will move towards $50, $100, something relatively small, and the speed will be a few hours. And because we're moving to this age of precision/personalized medicine, everybody is going to have their sequenced genome as the foundation of their electronic medical record. And so when we're able to track the genotype and the phenotype, so what your genes say and your life experience, particularly when things that have a genetic foundation happen, or how they happen, then we're going to be able to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to map, to track what are the correlations, not between single gene mutations and attributes, but between very complex traits. And so we're going to know more and more, and so we're going to be super empowered in the selection of early stage embryos in PGS. Second phase, again with technology that already exists, not for human applications, is using induced stem cells to create unlimited numbers of egg cells. I talked about that average of 15 for egg creation. Human male sperm production is hundreds of millions per ejaculation, so that is not a problem. But for women, for human hominin women, there is a restriction, but already there are models, animal models, of taking any type of cell, turning that into an induced stem cell, an iPS cell, that stem cell into an egg cell, and egg cell into an egg. So now let's say you have 100, let's say you have 1,000 fertilized eggs, you do the same embryo screening, but now the range of possibility is much greater. And even then, you could mate these early stage embryos with other early stage embryos. So we could go through hundreds of years of evolution in a relatively short period of time. And then the third technology, again, all technologies that already exist in their early stages, is what we're here to talk about today. And that is precision gene editing. And again, we were talking in the green room before about just where in our lives we were when these technologies started happening. And everything is so recent. I mean, people who would say, oh, God, I graduated 10 years ago, and it was a different world. And the speed, we're going to talk about it, but the speed of innovation is incredible, and it's only getting faster. So Robbie is going to talk a little bit more about what CRISPR is, and I think all of you probably know some. But it's not just CRISPR. I mean, there are many different technologies that exist, and more that likely will exist, that will allow us to basically hack the code of the human being. And all of this creates fundamental challenges and fundamental questions that we're going to explore in our conversation today. Issues of equity, of diversity, of values. How do we deploy our traditional values to make wise decisions? What kinds of new values, if any, do we need to create to help us navigate this very, very challenging space? And as societies and groups struggle with this, we all come from different cultures, with different backgrounds and different orientations. How can we avoid a situation where different groups or different countries are following approaches that are so fundamentally different that it creates real conflict of all kinds? I mean, I'm a science fiction writer, but you could really get carried away with your imagination of all of the possibilities, all of the permutations for where this could go. And what that means is that everybody here needs to be part of this global conversation of figuring out how are we going to first understand this technology and its implications, and then how are we going to come together to really struggle with it? Because anybody on either side of this spectrum who says that this is easy, and it's easy either on the far end of transhumanism, of people who say, well, this is easy, we should just be and have an environment where anything goes, in my view, that's a cop-out. And when people say, oh, this is an easy one, all we have to do is ban this technology, in terms of biotech and in terms of healthcare, this is about as far as we should go as a species, that obviously is a cop-out too. We are all going to be someplace in this difficult, challenging, messy place in the middle. And for the rest of our lives, and our children, grandchildren, and basically forever, we are going to be struggling with these very thorny, very challenging ethical issues. And we're all going to be drivers of this conversation. Because this is not a conversation about science. This is a science-based conversation about the future of our species. And everybody has to be part of that conversation. Everybody has to be informed, and everybody has to feel empowered that you are a driver of this dialogue. So with that, we'd like to ask our panelists to come up. And so we are going to kind of set the table, if you will, with our conversation in the beginning. But really, this is a conversation for everybody. So it'll be about half of the time will be our conversation among ourselves, and maybe half of the time, and then we'll have some engagement during that time, and then half of the time we'll be engaging with all of you. And you are the panel for the second half. We just happen to be sitting here, so the panelists are all there. The audience is here for the second half. So, Robbie, why don't we start with you? If you could just give us a little background about precision gene editing and CRISPR, and CRISPR certainly is what everybody's talking about. Is this the end of the road for gene editing, or what do you think might come next?
Great, so thanks for the introduction, and Jamie stole a tiny piece of my thunder there. I have to admit to you all, I've never used CRISPR. I have a PhD in bioengineering, recently acquired. I got my PhD from the Department of Biological Engineering at MIT in 2012, and it wasn't anything that they were doing back then. And I left the lab and haven't been back since then. So everything I am telling you is based on an outsider's perspective, an informed outsider's perspective, but an outsider's perspective. So, what I like to start with here is, in a sense, CRISPR is actually not revolutionary, but it's just evolutionary. It's the most recent in a long line of improved techniques for genetically engineering things. What it is, though, it is the cheapest and easiest method of genome editing to date. And the number of labs that have adopted it around the world is quite staggering, considering just the short number of years that it's been around. So if you know all of this, bear with me, but for those of you who don't know, I'm going to put a little bit of this into context, both the features of why it's so important and then some numbers around it. So first of all, I think that one of the real key features here is that it uses RNA to act as a guide for where it cuts DNA. The previous techniques used proteins. And so by using RNA, it allows us to take advantage of the fact that it's very easy to design and synthesize RNA relative to proteins. In the past, it might have cost thousands of dollars in weeks or months to make a genetic change to an organism. Now, you might be able to do it for less than $100 and in a few days or even hours. It has a very high efficiency, and we're rapidly moving to a point where it probably will have no off-target effects or no detectable off-target effects. What's really interesting is that it can be introduced with several guide RNAs, so you can do multiplexed genome engineering all at once. So that allows you to massively multiplex your experiments. It also has a lot of flexibility in organisms. So I don't know if anybody yet has found an organism that it doesn't work in. If you know of one, raise your hand and say so. But the last I heard, nobody had found an organism that it didn't work in. And it also has so many applications, even just at the highest level you can talk about. Medicine and agriculture, animals and plants and microbes, really allows us to be very creative as engineers and designers and scientists. So let me give you some numbers to give you a sense of what this has meant. The first publications were out in 2013, which is why I get a pass on not having used it. As of March 2016, Adgene, which is a nonprofit up in Cambridge, which collects plasmids and distributes them, had sent out 60,000 CRISPR-related molecular tools. That was 17% of its total shipments to researchers in 83 countries. And the company's CRISPR-related pages, and they have a pretty good set of resources there, have been downloaded more than 1 million times just in 2015. So that's on Facebook, but for something this wonky, it's pretty good. Keep in mind that the numbers for all of these were basically zero prior to 2013. Publications. In 2011, there were 100 CRISPR-related publications. 2015, 1,000. Keep in mind that iPS cells, which as everyone knows got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, at their peak in 2013 reached 1,500 publications. And we're still going up for CRISPR. Funding is another great one. So in 2014, funding for CRISPR-related projects was $140 million. Prior to that, it had never been more than $30 million. So we saw, more than a quadrupling. So I will stop there, but that gives us a sense of just how quickly things have changed.
Yeah, which is unbelievable. And then, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of set the table, kind of lay the foundation for where we're going, which is the big picture implications. But to start, Matthew, right now, there's a huge amount of work that's happening in agriculture and in animal husbandry. So with CRISPR corn, apples, mushrooms that are relatively soon coming to the grocery store, with animals, hornless dairy cattle, these Chinese goats that have big muscles and long hair, the micro pigs, which sound kind of cute as pets. Maybe I'll get one. Should we be worried? What's your sense of where we are now with using CRISPR and precision gene editing in animal and plants? And should we be worried about that?
So I'm an ethicist and a philosopher, so I come at this from sort of, what are we to be doing with respect to these technologies. And just on the animal, I think one of the big issues is going to be unintended consequences. So it's going to be, if you have these genetically modified organisms, what's going to happen when you release them into the wild, right? Are you going to end up causing species, different species to go extinct? That's one very big worry. Another worry is going to be what happens when they get into the food chain, right? So it could be, the biggest one will be sort of when they get into our food chain, but there's even lower ones, right? And when they get into other animals' food chains, it could, again, cause species extinction. And then the third part is just going to be things like mutations. We don't know exactly how the genetic modifications are going to play out in the wild. And so it could be that we end up creating organisms that we never anticipate. And so some of them we could end up creating antibiotic-resistant bacteria, superbugs, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the things that we really should be watching out for.
So Jamie, sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting to hear the list that Matthew just went through, because you could take us back 20 years, and you could list those same concerns for recombinant DNA technology and what it's doing. In fact, if you go back and watch the Cambridge City Hall debates from the 70s, you will see those same things being talked about. So this is not to discredit the point here, but this is actually to circle back to my original point, which is this is just the next in a long line of techniques for genetically engineering organisms.
It's funny with CRISPR, which is different. I'm actually very comfortable with GMOs, but with CRISPR, everything you do with CRISPR, at least in this early stage with plants and sometimes animals, it could have happened naturally. It just might have taken about 10,000 years, and we can do it. You're not bringing other DNA in. You're just changing what is expressed. And the other thing, and I think that Matthew, in your conversation, there's two different kinds of things, both of which I think could be concerning. One are these applications that are coming out of labs. And the other is gene drives, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, where we're thinking about well, can you push a trait through an entire population? So there's overlap. It's same, and it's also different. And Marnie here is a specialist in public engagement around these topics. And we're going to come back to Marnie, but I just don't want you to feel unloved. Let's be actually here. You can say something. Yes.
I'll just jump in and one thing to your point, Robbie, is that very much, these ethical issues are really timeless, and the technology pushes the urgency that we're having these discussions, and as the technology changes, we still wind up coming back to those same questions, and I think that in my space of public engagement, and I think that means that these are questions that people are pretty comfortable talking about, and we can get to that more later.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, because it connects to what Robbie said and what Marnie just said. The speed of change. Yeah. We had a long time to get used to the wheel or the wheelbarrow or all these kinds of things. But this, when you think, it's now I guess 3.5 years ago was the first time people realized, oh geez, you can use CRISPR for other kinds of genes, not just bacteria. And then it's, a year and a half later that someone says, oh, wait a second, you can use this technology for gene drives to push a change through an entire species. And then someone said, wait a second, couldn't you end life on Earth accidentally? So I think that this speed is a really big deal. So just again, as part of this laying the foundation, Robbie, if you could just say a few words about medical applications that are in the pipeline, things that are happening now.
Yeah, sure. And so I do think it's, following up on your point there, this is the time to thank the organizers of this panel, right? Because if you were sitting in the audience and saying, oh, this is all so hypothetical and out there in the future, it's not going to matter, you're wrong, okay? I think the lessons we learned from any new technology development, whether it's in the digital space or in the life sciences, is that we've seen these things come on faster and in ways that we maybe didn't necessarily expect, and it surprises society. And so even if as scientists we are quite comfortable with our understanding of the specifications of the technologies and the applications of them, and we've done the risk-benefit analysis in our minds or in our fields, the rest of society may not be there with us. And it's incumbent upon us to be having these kind of conversations and really listening as well as talking. Yeah. So with that being said, what I did was I basically just went to the pipeline web pages for a couple of the companies that are in the space. I think it's important to note, and they will the companies who are developing medical applications in the space will say nothing that is happening right now in any of these companies is human germline modification. So they're just changing the cells that in a way that they don't get passed on to the next generation. But there are applications for liver diseases, hepatitis B, for example, blood, sickle cell anemia, eye diseases, both infectious and those that are passed on genetically, muscle, like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, central nervous system diseases, lung, like cystic fibrosis, obviously cancer treatments, engineering T cells. So, that's a lot of diseases and a lot of money to be made, potentially, right? And we're only now talking about cells and changes that don't get passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, and even that conversation, we were talking in the green room before, right now, yes, gene therapies are about how do we cure one disease that somebody has, and we'll talk about regulation in a moment, but in the early stages, we were talking, at that time the language was cloning. People thought, all right, so this non-germline, non-heritable changes, that was good, because that was therapeutics. And then heritable, germline genetic manipulations, those were bad. And that was where the consensus was about a little more than 10 years ago. Now we've blown through that, and the first little hole in the dam was the debate that happened in the United Kingdom on the issue of mitochondrial transfer, which you don't need to go to, but basically, if you think of the cell as the egg yolk and the egg white, women who have mitochondrial disease have faulty mitochondria in their egg white, and so you swap either at the egg stage or the the fertilized egg stage, you swap out the egg white. So the UK had a long debate, a 3-year debate about whether it was okay to begin clinical trials, because that was the so-called three-parent babies, you have the nuclear parents and the mitochondrial mother, additional mother. And so then it was like, all right, there was a level of comfort. I mean, it was not huge comfort, but comfort enough that both houses of Parliament voted to authorize clinical trials. So it's all of these things where we think that there's a red line. And it turns out that when we look at it, and we look at it from different perspectives, those red lines aren't as much as we thought. And so, Matthew, maybe you can talk a little bit about this report this week, about if you and Robbie or Marnie can do it also, like about this the chimeric egg, the putting of the human stem cells into the pig embryo.
Also, that report just came out today, which is where they put the they put human cells into the pig embryos, and they were for the longest the study also put things like rat and mice, rat cells into mice embryos, etc., and also rat cells into pig embryos, and they were successful with the mice-rat combination, but not the mice-pig combination, and they were sort of successful. There were sort of some mixed successes, but they did end up being able to get some human cells reproduced in the pig embryo. And the application of that is that, one application is there's going to be a huge shortage of kidneys.
There is a huge shortage. 8,000 people on the waiting list waiting for kidneys.
And it's going to get worse.
So you should
sign up to be an organ donor.
It's going to get worse because with self-driving cars, we're not going to have any accidents.
Damn it.
Some people are saying that.
But there's still recreational motorcycle use. He jokes, but the organ donation system actually was developed prior to the advent of seatbelts. Part of the reason the DMV is the owner of that information, although they're not, you could go into that, is that was where, that was a database that they collected, but also a lot of the deaths we being healthy organs were from car accidents. Yeah. We don't have as many car accidents anymore.
Yeah. When you go to the DMV, just ask not for whom the bell tolls.
And so what they're trying to do now is they're trying to see if they can reproduce basically human organs inside pigs. Yeah. And so one of the things is, one problem is with compatibility, sort of the rejection of sort of these organs when they're produced in pigs. And so they're now, the next step is they want to use CRISPR to go in to maybe sort of modify it so that there wouldn't be high rejection rates.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. And just to talk about that work, some of that work is going on in the lab of George Church, which is down the hall from my group. And one of the successes there is that they've, in trying to minimize the risk of rejection, is that they've been able to use CRISPR to target some 62, and it may be more by now, sites within the genome, with CRISPR, which is just, going far beyond what Robbie was talking about with the single gene disorder, but that it may really be possible to modify many sites at a single time.
Yeah, and which I think it will be. And the point, I think the meta point here is that what we thought of as boundaries, the things that kind of made sense, are constantly changing. So crossing the germline, that was a boundary. Chimeric embryos, that for many people was a boundary. And so it's not that we're going to have an answer. It comes back to the original point that this will be a process and it's going to take our entire lives and the lives of everybody for a long, long time. There aren't answers. What there are is thinking about what are our values and how can we constantly apply our values to enhance our humanity, our family's humanity, and our species and the world. But while we do that, it will have to happen within a regulatory context. I hope it will have to happen within a regulatory context. Otherwise, we will be in big trouble. And that's one of the issues that we face now, is that just different societies have different traditions, different ways of thinking about different levels of comfort with various kinds of manipulations, whether they're population manipulations, and there are some countries that have had one-child policies and that were comfortable with those kinds of population-wide manipulations, or environmental manipulations, and all these kinds of things where just different societies have different histories and traditions and philosophies. So, Robbie, you've been focused for these last 4 years on the U.S. regulatory landscape. Could you just give a quick assessment of how the U.S. regulatory structure is thinking about these issues?
Yeah, sure. And before I do that, I want to take a step back. And I actually like the word governance more than regulatory as a meta concept here, because regulatory implies, a law that has been written and some sort of agency, whether a government agency that comes in and says you can do this, you can't do that. Governance is a broader term, and it can include regulations, but it can also include just pacts, that we shall not do this. So a great example of governance in the life sciences is what happened in Silomar, right? The community got together, and at that point there were a small enough number of people that they were all able to get in one room, or for the most part. I'm sure they left some people out, because that always happens in history. Probably lots of women. What they did was they said, hey, here are the things that we will commit to never doing. And then in parallel with that, the federal government said, okay, well, we're going to take a look at it and see if there are any other gaps that we need to fill in, whether there are some actual roles for the government in this space. So the federal government's approach to regulating genetically engineered things, plants, animals, microbes, and even humans, or drugs and products that are given to them, started out of that recombinant DNA conversation. And in the 80s, during the Reagan administration, they basically the White House pulled all of the
science agencies, both those funders of science and the regulators of scientific products, and said, how do we make sure that these things are safe? But also, because Reagan was very much a deregulatory president, how do we make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't stifle what we think is going to be a vibrant sector? You know, I will say, I think they did a pretty good job. We now have a biotech sector that is that's turning in north of like 350 million a year. 350 billion a year in revenues, right? Which is a large fraction of the economy, and actually, you know, bigger than cars and a lot of other things. So they set up a frame, and to date, you know, we've had very few harms that have been done by these products. I think, you know, some of the gene therapy ones are some of the few examples, but for the most part, it has worked really well. The approach has been a very federated approach. So NIH has the responsibility for establishing the research guidelines and regulating on that end of things. There's that the NIH has been going through a very introspective process with a lot of engagement with the community to make sure that those guidelines are right, thinking about what to do with the RAC and other things there. And then you have FDA and EPA and USDA. And so I could speak nauseatingly long on this and put you all to sleep, but what I can tell you is that on January 4th, for the first time since 1992, those three agencies wrote down on a single piece of paper what their current roles and responsibilities are vis-a-vis all products of biotechnology. So plants, animals, microbes with applications in food and agriculture and biofuels and drugs and everything like that. So these agencies recognized the challenges they were facing. The reason they did this was not because they wanted to figure out what they were doing now, although that is important, but really how do they get ready for the future. And so they are actively now thinking about how to update their own regulations in order to get ready for the future. And a week after that, just last week, FDA and USDA both released proposed revisions to some of the regulations. FDA for genetically engineered animals, USDA for genetically engineered crops.
Did they, just a question, so I understand that in the US, there are sort of regulations about inserting foreign sort of organisms into, you know, sort of like in the old days, you know, to insert viruses, you know, to sort of gene therapy and things like that. But the problem with CRISPR is that you're just editing. And so, at least in the US context, there doesn't seem to be regulations against CRISPR in that respect. Whereas, say, in the European framework, they regulate both.
So the answer to your question is that it is actually much, much more complicated than the way I reject your premise. Okay. In non-polite terms, yes. The way that the U.S. agencies think about it is what is the product and what is the application, right? Because we have the system of regulation and it predates biotechnology is, hey, if you have a food product, go to the food agency, right? We don't care whether you made that food in your shoe, in your lab, in the field, right? Like, if you're going to market it, you got to go to the food agency. If you have something that is a chemical product, you got to go to the chemical agency, right? So the answer is it's very complicated. I can tell you that if your question is about animals, FDA's proposed revision to their oversight of genetically engineered animals is that any modification to an animal, whether it's a deletion or a single site base pair modification, would potentially require oversight from FDA.
Right. Yeah, and the challenge for all of this, of course, is that every country, to varying levels, is trying to figure out what their national regulatory structure is, and coming at this with very different traditions. One of my favorites is the UK. They have their Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which I think is among the most thoughtful. It's far more centralized than ours. In Japan, they have a risk-based stratification of different technologies, and so the idea is a commercial mindset of how can we move products that are on the safer potential side of things to the market relatively quickly. And China, which actually has a decent legal framework in the sense that if you read the papers, you'd say, oh, well, that makes sense. But it's in terms of what people are actually doing, it's much more of a Wild West. And so will be a big, big challenge for everybody, is that what we're talking about are these potential big changes. And when you're thinking about changing animals or any kind of germline application, that's not a national issue. Because birds fly, humans, go to Club Med in other countries and meet other people, and then you can pass genes that way if you're not careful. And Robbie mentioned Silmar, which is great, but there was a time in our history where the relative importance of the scientists in the grand scheme of things was much more important. And we've had our equivalent of Silmar a year ago, December 2015, where the scientists from US, UK, China, and others came together. It was a very extremely thoughtful deliberation. And there's been a whole process.
But just to be clear, that was only about germline.
Yeah.
That wasn't about all.
No, I agree. So it was a very thoughtful conversation, but then it came out a few weeks later that even though this group had called for a pause in the application of precision gene editing to humans, 4 different research groups in China had all basically were in the process of already doing it on non-viable human embryos. So there will always be a regulatory triage. There will always be, until we have some kind of global system. And you're absolutely right. It has to, first there would be a norm creation, and then over time there could be some kind of regulatory relationships that could try to create an environment where there aren't gaps. But right now there are, and that's one of the dangers. But another danger, Marnie, is that what we're talking about is the future of our species. And even when the scientists are talking, even when the regulators are talking to each other, which they're doing, and it's very important, there are whole groups of people, population probably more generally, but even subsets of the population who aren't as much in that conversation. What is your assessment of that, and what are we doing, and what can and should we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the conversation that we're having in here right now is just miles and miles apart from, the conversations that I have when we go outside. I don't think we have to go very far from here to find people who not only aren't aware of CRISPR, but aren't aware, that there's $1,000 genome sequence within reach that maybe hasn't seen genetics since high school. And so there's, I guess the first thing I'd say is the public is not a monolith. There's great diversity in what the public is aware of what's going on with these technologies. Go into some communities, and particularly affluent communities around where we are in Boston, you can find that there are plenty of people who have had their 23andMe done, have a lot of questions about that, and some people who have heard of CRISPR. But on the other end of the spectrum, that there are people who haven't heard anything about that, and some people who are quite angry about that. So maybe if I can just, and I feel a little glued to my seat, but I would rather walk around. But I will. I can make it work. We've been to classrooms in Boston, and we've heard students say things like, my mother, who pays her taxes for all of you to do her research, she's never going to see any benefit from it, because she doesn't have health insurance. And people who say, a student who said, people say that there's something wrong with me because I'm angry, that there's something wrong with my genes, but I have a lot to be angry about. There's a history of where genetics has been, that with pseudoscience, genetics has been used to discriminate against segments of our society, history of eugenics. And that, along with many other disparities in our society, has led to a lot of anger when you bring up some of these technologies. I would say that in the spirit, and I think that is not exclusive to minority communities, historically underrepresented communities. I think that there are people who we were talking about somatic gene editing for gene therapy before. Probably true that most people are fine with that. But I think if we talk to enough people, there are people who wouldn't be. And so, to Robbie's point about really listening, what we're about is a conversation about how we use these technologies, but a conversation where it's really a two-way street, where we hear the diversity of viewpoints, and some people have a lot of things that they want to talk about before they have that conversation. I was at a meeting of African American pastors to talk about precision medicine, and there was one pastor who came, and the first thing he said is that people in my congregation are angry that I'm here. They are angry because before I have this conversation with you, that we need to address several issues. One, how do we know that our genetic information will not be used against us? Two, how do we know that the scientists we would give, and I should say my group is not affiliated with research in any way, but if people in my congregation were to say sign up for a research project, would the information be communicated with us transparently and in a way that we can really understand? And then three is equity. We don't just want to be part of the research process, but will we be the ones to see those benefits? And so I think that there's a lot of issues that we need to address, not just about how we use the technologies, but how do we get everybody to the table? And that's really where our work at PGED is focusing.
Yeah, I think it's such a critical and important point. As I was saying before, this is really about the future of our species. And we have lots of examples where there was a conversation to be had where we didn't have it. And then when we, later on in the process, even for something that people thought was good, when people were in the early stages of developing genetically modified crops, the scientists thought, this is incredible. We're going to save hundreds of millions of lives with this stuff. Who could ever be against it? But once you lose the narrative, once people feel that you're pulling a fast one on them, it's really difficult, probably almost impossible, to get that narrative back. And because we're at this very early stage of technological development, it's absolutely the work that you're doing, others are doing, to make sure that this is an inclusive conversation where people aren't just being briefed, but people are being engaged, and their viewpoints are part of the process. This science is moving forward. Countries can opt out for their own benefit and at their own risk. But that doesn't mean it's inevitable that the technology will develop in one specific way. And the idea, at least the ideal, is that if we have these kinds of conversations, we can make sure that as the science advances, which it will, that it can do so in a way that's transparent, where people are engaged, where people's viewpoints are incorporated. That doesn't mean that what everybody wants, everybody will get. But that stuff is really important. And yet, Matthew, as we move forward, I'm trying to think of this in like three phases. Like right now, we are in a phase where there are big questions about what information will people have, what kind of research will be done. And let's think of that as kind of the now and then over the next 5 years. And then maybe 5 to 10 years, there's going to be, in my view, at least a transition of healthcare from this generalized healthcare that we have to a personalized healthcare that's based on people's genetics and people's personalized everything. And then beyond that, there will be this period where these technologies, the debate over these technologies, will not be about healthcare. It will be about the future of our species, far, far, far beyond healthcare. So in this first phase, when we're thinking about how to kind of regulate, govern, whatever the word is, the technology has huge and profound short-term implications, but also long-term implications. How can we think about creating the right balance on issues like what research should or shouldn't be allowed, what access to information should people have, how much consumer choice should people be allowed?
Yeah, great. So I find it useful to sort of distinguish between technological challenges versus ethical challenges, or sort of normative concerns. So the technological challenges are things like how, when we're developing these technologies, how do we go about developing them, right? And there are going to be ethical issues arising out of technological challenges. there's going to be sort of research ethics. You know, who are you enrolling? The first clinical trials, first human clinical trials, when you get from the animal models to the human trials, et cetera. So those ethical issues are going to come up, right? And then there are going to be clinical ethics issues. So once you have once you've developed the product, it's in phase 4, phase 3, et cetera, now you want to sort of put it out there. There's going to be issues about privacy. There's going to be issues about genetic counseling. Is this sort of for the right, is this appropriate? Is this product appropriate for you, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's in addition to that, there's a separate concern, which is sort of what happens when we can do these technologies perfectly, right? And then there's the question of should we be doing this as a society? And that's some of what Marnie was getting at, which is some people think even if we could do all these things perfectly, we shouldn't be doing it, right? So there are people who think, look, you're playing God here, right? They're sort of, and then there are sort of other people who think, you could be endangering the entire sort of human species, right? And the intended consequences I mentioned. On the other side of the spectrum, there are people who think we have the obligation to do it, right? They think that the survival of the human species depend on it. So it's the exact reverse argument, where, this planet is, the sun's going to burn out at some point, right? So we know that at some point we got to get off this planet. And so one of the ways, Stephen Hawking talks about how genetic engineering is going to be a way by which we get off this planet. And so from there, and I'll be very brief, and then there are some people who think, anything goes, you can just sort of do whatever you want. And I have, in my own work, I try to straddle between these two perspectives. So I have something, what I call the human rights perspective, which sort of depends on two assumptions. Okay, so one is that everybody has equal moral status. So, and I'll explain why that's really important. That's important because that means that even if you're disabled, if you have cystic fibrosis, if you have Down syndrome, et cetera, you still have the equal moral status, okay? And then the other is that it's something from my human rights work where I say that human beings have what I call the human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a good life. So there are a bunch of capacity, things that you need to be able to think, to be able to interact with other people. There are a bunch of fundamental capacities that you need qua human being in order to pursue a good life. Okay, so from those two premises, I've argued in my work that we can come up with a framework, a very minimum framework for when it's not permissible, when reproductive genetic engineering is not permissible and what it is. So I'll just give you two examples and I'll stop. So one example is you shouldn't create human beings that will lack the fundamental capacities for pursuing a good life, right? So if you can genetically modify it, so now we got CRISPR and all these synthetic human genome, et cetera, or in vitro mutagenesis, which we didn't talk about yet. What can you create? So one thing you shouldn't create is human beings who are not going to have all these capacities so that they can pursue a good life. So one obvious example would be if you can, once you have these technologies, you can deliberately create a child with cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs. Well, this theory tells you, no, you shouldn't do that. People who want to do that, they're not allowed to do that. So there's a sort of a bottom cutoff, right? A more controversial example is something like deafness. Okay, and I'm happy to talk more about that. So I think deafness is a fundamental capacity. Okay, so I think that you shouldn't deliberately create an embryo that's going to be deaf. That's very controversial. I'm happy to talk more about that. Now, the second thing I'll say is this. Once you have an embryo, once you have an offspring that you've already created, and it lacks certain fundamental capacities, say it lacks the hearing genes, right? On my view, it'd be perfectly fine to bring this offspring to term. Now, why is that? The reason is because this offspring has equal moral status, just like everybody else. So it doesn't matter if it's Down syndrome, it doesn't matter if it's deaf, et cetera, et cetera. If a parent decides that, she wants to bring this offspring to term, she should have the right to do so. And this theory, because even though the offspring doesn't have all the fundamental capacities, it's got enough fundamental capacities to be able to pursue a good life. So here we get two implications of the theory. And so I think that goes some ways towards addressing some of the concerns that, say, disability activists have about some of these technologies. They worry about negative eugenics, the fact that you're going to create this so that you're going to discriminate against disabled people. Well, this theory says, no, every human being has equal moral status, so we don't do that. At the same time, we shouldn't be creating individuals who lack certain fundamental capacities.
Yeah. And it's a challenge, because that philosophy won't last very long because of what's coming. Just in the sense that if you're choosing, if those principles apply, if you're choosing from, let's say, in phase 1, your 100 fertilized eggs, should you be allowed, and everybody would agree that if somebody exists and they have any kind of trait, whatever, they're all equal humans. But should you be, if you were a parent, you have 15 fertilized eggs, should you be allowed to pick the one that has Huntington's disease and is going to live 5 years old? Should that be legal? Let's just say it's legal. Would your insurance company or your government, depending on where you are, have an obligation to pay for those 5 years of treatment until that child dies? And then, so very, very quickly, we get into these issues. And then let's just say that you're in that situation, and whatever the disease is, let's just start with one of these single-cell Mendelian diseases, it could be fixed in the early stage embryo. Is it an obligation to fix it, or is that a violation of that embryo? So we're getting to this. As you're noticing, we're kind of doing this step by step. In my introductory remarks, I talked about IVF and sequencing of the genomes of pre-implanted embryos. So right now, it exists. You have IVF. Those, as you know from biology, 1 cell, 2 cell, 4 cell, 8 cell, 16 cell. And around 5 days in PGS, you extract 2 cells from each and you sequence those. And then you get information based on that sequencing. And the information that you get is just based on wherever we are in our knowledge and understanding of the genome, which is always increasing. So by a show of hands, who believes that if you, and assume that you're all mothers, and you, prospective mothers, and you're going through IVF, you've decided to do PGS, and so you will get, let's say, 10 of the genome readings. Who here believes that you should have, raise your hand, you should have access to those, all of the information, whatever those genomes say, whatever those genes say in all of those 10 embryos, that you should have unlimited access to that knowledge. Raise your hand if you think you should have unlimited access to that information. Okay? Many of you. All right, put your hands down. Who thinks that you should not have unlimited information? Much smaller number. Okay. So now you have, let's make it 10. You have 10 pre-implanted embryos. Who here thinks you should have unlimited ability to choose which of those 10, your 10 natural children, should be implanted? Who thinks you have unlimited choice? Okay, put your hands down. Who thinks that your choice of which embryos to be implanted should be limited? Raise your hand. All right, so a little bit less. It's very interesting because, as you'll see, when we start walking down that path, as we know more and more about the genome, we're going to have a lot of information. Raise your hand. Now, who here thinks that people in China and India should have the right to choose what gender their children should be? Raise your hand if you think they should have a right to choose. Raise your hand if you think they should not have a right to choose.
Are you talking about naturally conceived children in utero or IVF?
Well, I'm fudging this.
It's a technical audience.
Yes, very good. The point that I'm trying to make is there are things when you say, well, like, it's happening less, but in places like China and India where people were using ultrasound and abortion as a crude way of getting boys. And everybody, I think, in this room would say, well, I'm against that. And so let's just say it's the same China and India, and everybody's having kids through IVF, and let's just say the culture hasn't changed, and then everybody says, well, I'm not having an abortion, but prior to the implantation of the embryo, I want to have a boy. And the question is that the same question, or is that a different question? And I'm not saying there's any answer, but I think that we can easily think one way and talk ourselves into believing something. So here's more questions for everybody. So now we're at the 10-year stage, and so we're doing IVF and we're doing embryo screening, and now we have this information. And I'm going to tell you a trait, and raise your hand if you think that you should be able, because you all were for unlimited information, most of you were for unlimited choice. So should it be legal raise your hand, for you to select an embryo that eliminates a deadly disease? So you're not selecting one of your 10, let's say, early stage embryos because it has a deadly disease. Who thinks that should be okay? Everybody thinks that. Okay. Who thinks it should be okay to select an embryo because based on the analytics of that genome, there's a high likelihood that of your 10, this child will live the healthiest, will have the highest level of health, meaning that they are unlikely to get lots of genetic diseases. Who thinks it would be okay to select a child because they are less likely to have genetic diseases over the course of their life? Everybody. Almost. Actually, raise your hand. Who thinks you shouldn't be able to do that? Okay. She's losing her will. Who thinks, raise your hand, it should be okay to select among your 10 the child that's likely to live the longest? Who thinks that should be legal? Okay. Who thinks that should be illegal? Okay. Who thinks it should be legal of your 10 to pick the child predicted to have the highest IQ? Raise your hand if you think it should be legal. Raise your hand if you think it should be illegal. Interesting. Who here thinks that it should be legal to pick a child who is likely to have the greatest level of empathy of your 10 possible children? Raise your hand if you think that should be okay. And now raise your hand if you think that should not be okay. Okay, interesting. It's interesting. These are all questions that we are going to ask. Steve Shu is a friend of mine at Michigan State who works at. He thinks that we're a year away from being able to very accurately predict height from a 5-day-old pre-implanted embryo. And about a decade, he has a great talk on this. About a decade away from being able to predict IQ. And then anything that has a genetic foundation, and depending on your belief system, it could be 50% of who we are is genetic, 80% of it. We are going to be facing, and we all are going to be facing all of these types of issues. But it raises these huge issues, like Marnie was saying, talking about access and diversity, which is our survival strategy as a species. So there's one kind of diversity is diversity of the population that exists today.
Wait, Jamie,
yes.
I'm just going to ask one more question.
Yes, of course.
Because I saw a look on a lot of faces.
Yeah.
How many of you were uncomfortable with Jamie's last 3 questions? Okay.
Yeah, you should be.
I feel like you should all be uncomfortable.
Yeah. So this is really uncomfortable stuff. And if you're not uncomfortable, find that uncomfort within you, because there aren't. So let me ask a question, maybe for Marnie. We talked about diversity of the population that exists today. How should we be thinking about our diversity as a species as a whole? Like about how our cultural biases might lead us, just like you talked about in the eugenics example, to make a set of assumptions about the future, like it's great to be a math genius, or it's great to be tall, or it's great to, whatever, have a symmetrical face, that could be dangerous to us. How do we think about diversity in all of its multifaceted aspects?
Right. We were talking about our talking a lot about that, and that's certainly a core of when we talk to the public is genetic complexity, and that it's not just the genes we're born with, but that's the environment we're living in and how it's acting on those genes and our microbes and all sorts of things. But that to say that, so I think that there's a strength to having diversity for our changing environment.
Yeah.
Certainly traits that we may think of as not the most desirable in our society can be really useful in certain situations.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that, that's important. I'm not sure if I'm completely answering your question. I think that it's really telling. We went to a high school, and these are great questions. I think that we have a lesson plan that really goes through and asks students a lot about where do they draw the line. And we start out that lesson by asking what, if you could choose traits that you would want your child to have or would not want your child to have, what would they be? And I've heard a lot of answers that have stuck with me. There was a young man and the teacher had pointed him out to us at the beginning of the class because he had Asperger's. And he said, I would actually like my child to have Asperger's because I can focus in a way that none of my classmates can. And I think that would be really good. We've had, there's some humorous answers. I have young children, so some of them say, well, I don't want my children to be annoying. And then we have to talk about whether or not that's genetic. But I've also been in a room of students, mostly non-white, and they said, I would want my child to have blonde hair and blue eyes. And think a lot about the values that went behind that, and if there's an economic advantage, behind that answer. So, I think that these are some of the experiences I've had that kind of wrestle with how we view diversity in our society.
And it's kind of ironic. It's ironic that of the social implications of Darwin. Like Darwin happens, and then the ideology around Darwin leads to eugenics, leads to Nazism, where it seems like it's the absolute wrong lesson of Darwin. Like the lesson of Darwin is diversity is the greatest strength of any species. It's the survival technique. That's how you get the mutation drives diversity, which allows for selection in changing environments. Matthew, like you're aching to say something.
Oh, happy to say something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was, on the race thing. Just going back to this human rights framework that I was talking about, notice that there wouldn't be an obligation. So some people think that, mainly the people who are perfectionists, they think we have an obligation to create the best children, the best life possible, right? Those people would think that you need to have children who are white, heterosexual, as tall, etc., right? But on my view, you don't need to do any of that because being white, tall, heterosexual is not a fundamental condition. So you don't need those things in order to have a good life. And so there's no obligation on that framework to have, to select the child like that. Do you want me to, I'll say something about the climate change?
Sure.
Yeah,
in space.
Yeah, and so because we're talking about the human species now. So one of the, as I was mentioning earlier, once you start sort of, going further into the future, there's the question about the survival of the human species. And one of the big problems is climate change, right? How can we combat climate change? And I know, some people deny that that's even a problem, but hopefully not no one in this room. Supposing that it's a problem, it's a really big problem. We don't really have a solution to addressing these problems. But one of the things that we can do is actually through human engineering, through sort of gene editing, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just give one example, because Jamie mentioned the stuff about height. So I actually argued in print that it would actually be good to have children who are smaller, right? Taller people use much more energy. Think of the lifetime resources in terms of transporting cars, like airplane travel, like all the energy, all the food that you need to take in over a lifetime. That's huge. Add all that up, right? So now, say you got a choice between China's one-child policy, where you can only have one child, or you can have, you can use or you can have 5 medium-sized children, right? With the same greenhouse gas emission. Seems like it's much more liberty-enhancing, right, to use genetic engineering to, address that particular problem. So thank you for that.
Yeah, but I just, not to stereotype, but I mean, your model that people use genetic engineering to have white male heterosexuals as the dominant organizing principle. I think that dancing and clothes are really going to help. So please, don't, if any population engineers in the audience, please don't do that. So now, what I'd like to do, and then we'll come back to at the end for some final comments, is to open the floor for your thoughts and you can ask questions, you can give thoughts, you can ask questions to each other, you can answer somebody else's questions. But 2 questions that I'd like just to throw out there that you can answer if you want, but just at least to think about. One is, do you think that the human genome as is sacred? Is there anything sacred about it? Is there nothing sacred about it? Second is, and there's no right answer to this, but what's the right balance between progress, hubris, and humility? And how do we think about that? How do we think about finding that balance in a way that can work for everybody? So with that, we have microphones, and why don't we just, we'll go here, and my goal is that everybody who has something to say, I promise you will get to say your thing. So we will not leave, even though some it may get shorter if we have running out of time. What's that? And we will ask that, yeah. Yes, and please say your name when you start.
I'm Jeannie, I work here. So I want to address that first question that you raised about the human genome being sacred. I think it's a bit short-sighted, because if the technology is telling us anything, is that we are not alone. We are simply a drop in the bucket here on this planet. And if you consider aspects like the hologenome theory of evolution, which suggests that it's not necessarily the evolutionary pressures that are driving the change in one particular genome, but it's really the change in the network of genomes that drives evolution. I guess I'm just wondering, like, how is that being taken into consideration when people are thinking about genetic engineering of humans, and how our network of genomes that are existing in our bodies right now, or the network of genomes that are existing, in whatever capacity through their gene drives, mosquitoes or whatever, how do you think that could affect change downstream that might not have necessarily been considered because we consider our genome to be alone?
So your answer is the human genome is not sacred.
No. In my opinion.
Yeah, and it exists within the context of a broader set of overlapping ecosystems. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jim. I'm with City University of New York. I'd like to say, just the framework, this whole thing, the discussions that you're having today, and that I hope you will continue to have, are probably some of the most important things happening on the planet. Because I think about the development of nuclear weapons, and I think about the splitting of the atom, and this is almost far more important in terms of the human race and where we're going, and all of these important questions that you're asking. They have to be continued to be asked, and honest answers have to be provided. Now, if I may respectfully suggest, as a medical historian, I believe the history of medicine can provide some insight into some of the problems that you and everyone here is going to face. And if I just throw this out, basic medical science is conducted in this country in such a way that it serves business interests first, bottom line. There are many things in the basic medical sciences, okay, that just lay dormant in the journals and is never utilized for the benefit of mankind. My concern, and this goes back to the competitive nature of human beings, my concern is this, that some of the best technologies available will never be given or never be provided for the vast number of people that need them. And let me give you an example. In cancer research, for example, The p53 gene is known to be malfunctioning in many cancers. It misfolds, and it can be refolded with the simple addition of zinc. And that's correct. You can look this up. And bottom line is this. Unless we have an opportunity to really unleash what basic medical science has created, not just to manufacture pharmaceuticals or create the next, innovation, but to really help people. I'm afraid gene editing is going to go the way of just about everything else. It's going to be allocated to a very small group of people that have the money to utilize it, and the rest of humanity is just going to, they're going to have to deal with what they have to deal with. Thank you so much.
Hi. If you'd like to say something.
Yes. Why don't we have comments, then periodically we'll break, and then we'll give thoughts, and then like I said, everybody, if you want to say something, you will be able to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd actually like to modify one of your questions. Sure. Rather than saying, is the human genome sacred? I think a more accurate question is any part of the human genome sacred? A decent example would be for HLA, which is part of our standard immune system. I assume that most people understand that here. HLA is one of the main reasons why, in a lot of ways, our species has not died. It allows us to have sufficient genetic diversity that someone will survive something. If we start modifying that, because diseases also come with HLA modifications, there are thousands upon billions of trillions of different ways that it can be allocated to a single human. If we start modifying this in a specific way, could this in fact destroy the human race, as you were saying earlier? Not just other species, ourselves. And then I'm actually curious on a comment about what our previous speaker was talking about. Essentially, how do we stop the movie Gattaca from occurring? For those who don't know the movie, essentially everyone's genetic code was known by everyone and was used for both socioeconomic purposes as well as allocation of any other resource. And currently HIPAA is kind enough to not give out our genomic sequences to parties that shouldn't have it, but that might not be the case anymore soon. What are some definitive ways that you think it would be particularly important to safeguard from that kind of future?
Well, why don't we take two more comments, and then we can respond, and then people can respond to different pieces of evidence.
Hi, my name is Anjana. I'm from City University of New York, and I was wondering, we all talk about gene editing, fixing Mendelian one gene problem, or having a disease-free life, or creating a designer baby. But we are not realizing that whatever we are fixing, are we making an assumption that the disease-free life as well as designer baby life will be the excellent life on this planet? Or is it kind of equivalence of happiness in the life? We are not really connecting the genotype to phenotype features here. We are just fixing the problems or trying to make it superior as a human being. But I'm not sure that superior part is really superior, because somebody already mentioned about the P53 for cancer research. There were trials where there was a super P53 was introduced, and the results are not all that promising. Having an extra copy of that gene doesn't really guarantees that the person will not develop any tumors. There may be some delay, there may be some unintended outcomes.
Yep, so let's take one more, and then we'll just go right to left, starting with Robbie. So, I'm sorry, I can see you, but the people with the microphones have more power than I have.
Hi, my name is Susan Lauren. I'm not a scientist at all. So, I guess my question is, you keep asking the questions, but who owns the information and who really gets to make these decisions? By and large, it's you and the people in this room, as opposed to the parent who really, I think, when someone else is making that decision, whether or not they think it's the moral decision, is going back to pushing it from on high and why people don't trust this kind of, even the questions.
Yeah. So why don't we take a pause now? And again, everybody with a thought, that thought will be expressed and shared. Why don't we move? We'll go right to left, and then the next round we'll go left to right. So
Okay, so rapid fire responses. I just wanted to, how many of you read the Pew study that was published last summer, asking a couple thousand people what they thought about hypothetical but totally plausible biomedical enhancements? Oh my gosh, you have to go read it. Spoiler alert. Everyone's really worried.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the primary reasons why they're worried is because they think that the public who is surveyed, that it will enhance inequality, right? That these things will happen, and they will only be available to the elite. So that to your point there. I mean, it's not just you that feels that way. More than 2/3 of America feels that way as well, and not just about gene editing, but about many biomedical enhancements. So that's one. I think the other one that is really important to get your heads around is, we are living in a digital age, and all of the analog parts of your body will have digital counterparts in the future, okay? And that is mind-blowing to think about it. And when you realize how easy it is to access digital information, just ask John Podesta, and that was for risotto recipes, not for all of the things that really matter about who you are and what makes you who you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I have a couple thoughts. So just on the sacredness thing, the question whether the human genome is sacred, I think that maybe a different way of thinking about the issue is whether there's something special about us, right? And I think there is. And this is going to dovetail with what I think about what we should do. So what's special about human beings, I think, is the fact that we have something, what I call the genetic basis for moral agency. The fact that we all have this physical sequencing such that we can act morally. Some people get the benefits. Everybody in this room can. There are some people who have already lost it. They're sort of in persistent vegetative state. There are other people who are being blocked from being able to exhibit actual agency. But what we all have is this physical basis for moral agency. And that's what's special. So that sets a bar, again, about what we should be modifying. So if you have a technology, say you want to try to create a human pig chimera, and somehow that's going to take away the genetic basis for your moral agency, I'd be inclined to say that's where we should draw the line. Like, we shouldn't be creating entities that are going to lack moral agency. Okay, so now the second thing is that because we have that genetic basis for moral agency, I think that's what gives us the equality. That's why everybody's equal. Okay, so when everybody's equal, everybody also has what I call the human rights to the fundamental conditions for pursuing a life. That means that issues about access. We need to make sure that whatever inequality, there's a basic minimum that every human being has. Okay, they have access to universal health care to be able to, so that they can exercise their fundamental capacities. So not all of us need to be able to taste fine wine and things like that, but all of us need to be able to function properly so that we can think and do, have friends and sort of read books, etc., etc. Okay, and so I think that if you have those two components, that's going to go a long way towards answering issues about access, and that requires political will, right? You're probably not going to get it the next 4 years, but we do. But that gives you a ethical normative framework for where we should be.
So I have a bunch of notes. I'm going to speak to three things. One is awareness, respect, and trust. So awareness, and I appreciated your comments about the value that you found in this discussion. I just wanted to say that I completely agree, and that my group tries to make activities, to have discussion strategies, giving information to have discussions on these issues, and we put everything freely available online. So our website is pged.org. A lot of it is framed as curriculum right now, seen it used in middle schools, high schools, colleges, graduate level, and beyond. I mean, I think that they can also be kind of coffee table kinds of discussions, community groups. And somebody else mentioned Gattaca, which could really have been one of the driving forces of this conversations that we're having. I mean, this is not new, and that movie had a major role in. So I think that there's something to be said for the role of film in raising awareness, and hopefully that society that's comprehensively aware is also more protected against some of the issues that we're concerned about. Respect, wanted to come back to the question about is our genome sacred, and that we've been working recently with communities of faith. We've been going and having conversations about gene editing in some Christian congregations near us in Boston, and really, range of opinions. We actually had a conference where there was a pastor who came and was talking with leaders of genetics and genomics industries about what the ethical boundaries are, and a pastor gave a talk about kind of his theological considerations for how he looks at gene editing, and it was a really interesting conversation. And one point he raised was about the tenet of man created in God's image in Christian theology. And I think just that's where the respect comes in. We're never going to uniformly agree on all of these issues, but how can we find a way to really be able to listen to each other and have that respectful conversation? The policy, the governance is never going to work for 100% of people, but hearing each other. And then trust, and I think, Susan, you brought up that this is in the hands of scientists, and that's why, I think what you said is, and that's why there's fear. That much of this mission of awareness is not, in my mind, to teach people ACGT and the nuts and bolts of genetics, but to have this two-way conversation and to build trust that we're open to this dialogue, we're interested in what people have to say, and we can talk about the really scary stuff and just listen and not try to convince people of something. And so I think trust is going to be a really important part too.
Those are great points, and I'll just add just a few quick points. First, on the issue of values, and that's what all of this is about. This technology, the science is happening. The question is, who are we? What are our values? How will we figure out what our values are, and how will we apply our, in many cases, very old traditional values to this new set of challenges? And that's why this needs to be a conversation for everybody, and that everybody, like that's what I was saying before, you are the panelists, we just happen to be sitting here in less comfortable chairs. But it's your issue, it's your conversation, and we all have to go out into our lives and be engaging with people. On the issue of who owns our information, again, it's the same answer. Well, hopefully it's all of us. And we have to be if we are going to understand how the genome works, in order to have all of these miraculous healthcare outcomes that we all want, we're going to have to share our genetic information. Everyone's going to have to share their genetic information with everybody, because otherwise, how could you have a genome-wide association study to figure out how genetic diseases form and what they are? So we are going to have to be communists in that way, but we're also going to need to have some level of control about what happens with our genome. So you're right, HIPAA and U.S. government regulation protects your genome, but many of us, myself included, although I put a fake name, freely give our genetic information to 23andMe. There's a company that takes blood samples at triathlons and marathons, and people sign an unlimited waiver saying you can just use this sample for anything. So if you have somebody's blood and you have an unlimited waiver, I mean, this could be like a Star Wars situation. Third, coming back, that's like a clone army joke, it was not funny. To Matthew's point about the physical...
I don't think I ever saw stormtroopers swim.
So to Matthew's point about the physical basis for moral agency, it's a really challenging question. I'm not sure that I believe that, because then it's like, well, if that is the foundation of personhood, Peter Singer would say, well, that means that a chimpanzee who has a greater sense of self-awareness and moral agency would deserve more protection than a human being who didn't have that. And that's when he talks about euthanasia. I'm not saying that I'm not accusing you of that.
I have to comment on that.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about the physical basis for moral agency is that it turns out that chimpanzees can also have the physical basis for moral agency, right? So in that sense, chimpanzees very well could be persons and actually think that they are. So that's one thing. The other thing is that notice that on this account, it's the physical, it's not how much you can exercise. It's just the fact that you have the physical basis for moral agency that gives you the equality of standing. And so you don't have to have more. So the fact that, so we might have equal moral standing, but they wouldn't have more moral standing.
Yeah, so but by this then, I mean, it's a human being, an animal of some sort. It's a radical view relative to how we live our lives. I'm not saying it's wrong.
Right.
But it's certainly very challenging. And if we have the ability, which we will, to select embryos that have a greater capacity for moral thinking, for empathy, we're going to be faced, again, with these challenges that will very quickly push us to the edge of thinking through the implications of our philosophy, or not. And then the fourth point, I really appreciate the person who raised Gattaca, and a lot of people, I think, have seen that movie, because in your who here, raise your hand if you've seen Gattaca? Oh, perfect. That means that all of you are lovers of science fiction, and you recognize that science fiction can be a very effective vehicle for helping us think through these very challenging issues. Oh yeah, and I wrote my novels, and you can pick up the card. Sorry, I almost forgot. Okay, we're going back to the audience. Yeah, so, I think this one here already has the mic. Yes.
I'm Donna Bernstein. I'm a genetic counselor, and I would like to assuage some of the fears that are here and here if I can. First of all, we are trained pretty much as soon as we walk into the graduate program in non-directing. So about selecting embryos and about what comes from the top. Really, if you do not understand that it is not possible to impose your individual biases on another person's reproductive decisions, you're not going to pass the first, class, much less the boards or anything else. You're not going to practice. So we take it very seriously, and we understand that our job is to help talk through all of the potential implications so that individuals have as much information as they can have at the time to make the best decisions that are right for them based on their values and their circumstances. Nothing to do with ours. So that's one thing. There's also something called the GINA Act, which is genetic information protection. And this really means that it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of genetic information. Because it's illegal doesn't mean it never happens. No. So I would say, again, this is a good reason why people would want to talk through genetic testing before they do it, and in case there's concerns about life insurance or long-term care or other issues that may come up, even though there's laws that protect from employment discrimination still happens, and it's something to think about before going ahead with it. And then the other side of another really important point is that we're already doing a lot where FDA-approved genetic therapeutics that change genetic expression. And when you have a child who would otherwise die of Duchenne muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis, somebody who's in their 20s, and they're just waiting for somebody to find the way to help change the specific mutation that they have so that they can live a longer, better life. It really is a moral obligation to do our best to try to help as many people as we can.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Juliana Lemire. I'm a writer of the American Council on Science and Health. I'm also a scientist. My question is kind of to Matthew, because although I can't necessarily, as a scientist, I really like this fundamental capacity argument because it clarifies all the questions that were being put out, right? Is it fundamental capacity or not? And while I can't see really an argument on amount of moral capacity, it's like have, don't have, the fundamental capacity, I could see, for example, me thinking something is a fundamental capacity and you arguing it's not, or vice versa. And we could probably have 50-50, right? Down a small, maybe subset of characteristics. So, whereas I feel comfortable with that decision being put in your hands, quite frankly, I'm not sure whose hands those could go into. How are we going to determine those?
And then let's do it and we'll come back at the end. But it's nice that you have such faith in Matt, too. I just met him, he has honest face, for sure. All right, so why don't we'll go back and forth between the two people with the mics. Yes?
Hi, I'm Kripa. So my question is at the other end of the spectrum. We've been talking about designing kids, plants, animals. I'm wondering about the millions of people whose jobs depend on these crops and animals, and he spoke about releasing these into the wild and what kind of changes those bring about. But I'm wondering, like, if you have a plant that you need to water like once a week, and with, self-driving cars and supermarkets that don't need humans anymore, isn't that a valid question to worry about, like putting millions of farmers out of jobs eventually?
Yep, go back here. Yes?
And I just wanted to make a comment, and Marnie, what you're doing is kind of like what some Modelos, I work here as well, trained scientists, I'm now in outreach. And as you notice, I'm like a spec in the audience, and I'm just worried about the diversity and when it comes to access to everyone, even something as simple as IVF, right? The people who can afford IVF or can even go about screening genetically already has a higher chance of getting a better child, in terms of genetically. How are we able to gain the trust from the minority population based on past events that have happened and their lost interest in science, in medicine? How do we explain some of these things to them? Because a lot of them, we're not here, because we're not in these types of institutions. How do we get that word out to the public to try and help them gain the knowledge needed? How do we make sure that they have access to things like this if this were to come out to the public? And make sure that everyone would have the chance and we won't get into a situation where we have a subset of people who can afford these type of things, would be like the higher end humans, and then what happens to the rest of the population. So what are your thoughts in, diversity, access, and knowledge to the population and minorities in general?
Yep, great question. All right, over here, where are we? Yeah.
Hello?
Yep.
Hi, I work in IT here. I just wanted to bring up something about your point about the access of genetic information to the public. I think that's inevitable, but the problem is in my opinion, we need a consensus on what's right before we open the barn door and let the horse out. Because the thing that people don't think about with biometric data is once your fingerprints or your eyeballs or your genetics get out, you can't get them back. And we're used to throw away credentials, so our systems are built around that. We need to build new systems of trust.
So we talked a bit about the issues of governance and regulation, and also kind of these ethical issues like Gattaca issues with science fiction. I guess one of the questions that hasn't been raised before is science fiction, the Orcs and Crate version. I don't know if you were familiar with the book by Margaret Atwood, but I don't want to give away the ending, but basically there's a bioterrorist that can make a disease that can basically reboot humanity and get rid of a selective population of humanity, leaving a little bit left over. And I just want your comments on how gene editing is different in kind to, with the ease of access of getting it. You're talking about 60,000 plasmids sent out in the last 3 years. Anybody with an incentive can do CRISPR in, the $5,000 budget right now or something like that. So what do you know, or what freedoms do we have to give up in order to have a secure world where a couple of weird individuals on one end of the spectrum cause havoc for the rest of us?
I can't see what's the microphone, so somebody on this side who has a microphone. Oh, no, nobody. All right, we'll go over here. Yep.
So I have a question, I guess, kind of related to the question another person just asked, but about consent. So I'm really interested in if my genetic information can be used to know things about not just myself, but about other people, members of my family, members of my ethnic group, my community. What gives me the right to disclose that, and how do researchers go about obtaining
consent, well, it's not just consent for my information to be out there, but information that can be used to find things out about other people.
All right, so this side is the active side.
Yeah, I actually have just a comment regarding diversity. This is not an issue in the future, it's actually an issue now. We do have problems where we have clinical trials or even like screenings and genomic analysis on, you know, recurrent mutations in cancer, and by far those cohorts are 98% Caucasian. So we have no idea, and we are then based.
And there's a gender bias in a lot of the cellular research that happens.
Yeah.
Too.
So those things are not something that we can think of in terms of those science fiction therapies of the future. This is something that affects a third of the population right now, because virtually a third of the population is about to be diagnosed with cancer, and I'm talking just about cancer because that's my field, but I think this conversation is really, really needed.
Yeah. So why don't we take one more, and then we'll do a round with us, and then we'll do just everyone who has an additional thought will get one sentence in the next round, and then we'll wrap up. All right. So yes.
Yeah. My name is Joe. I'm from Brooklyn. Now, all these discussions that you're having today, I've been hearing about these things for decades. As a matter of fact, I'm always reminded of that famous 18-year-old woman who wrote that famous book, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, who has such insight into the future. It seems like we're headed that way. But in all due respects, all this discussion that we're having has convinced me that I am a zombie like the rest of us. The future of people on this planet, the fact that we want to go to Mars and stuff like that. In fact, this morning I read an article in Science that what do we do with our dead people in space? How do you take care of that situation? I was always wondering, so far in 50 years of space and whatnot, why hasn't there been anyone giving birth in space yet? I always thought Barbero was a great movie. Now, I don't know if I can have any more say as to what's going on here, but one of the questions I would have for you is, since we're talking here in the United States, I assume we're basing everything about law in the United States, not international law. But other countries must be having discussions like this as well. China, Japan, Germany, and Saudi Arabia. You know, I wonder if any of you can mention which country is spending the most money per capita, for the size of the country, in genetic research and genetic advancement. And my reading tells me it's Saudi Arabia. Other than that, I have nothing else to say.
Okay, great. So why don't we'll start with Marnie, and we'll work left to right this time, and then when we're done here, we're going to go for our final round, but everybody only gets one sentence. And just we want to make sure everyone gets something to say, but we're running a little bit short.
No more than 2 independent clauses?
Yeah, well, not too many compound words or little segments, sentence fragments hanging. Go on, Marty.
Okay, so I'm going to fail miserably in addressing all of these fantastic comments. So feel free to come up to me afterwards if I've missed something that you said. One, genetic counselors, we need way more of them. And there are nations that don't have genetic counselors, and so I think that the U.S. is a little ahead in that, but it's such an important profession. Cancer, diversity, and clinical trials. I come from a family that has benefited from pharmacogenetic treatments of cancer in clinical trial context. But I could see no other way than my loved one signing up for that trial. And it's a huge problem that there are people who truly don't believe that what scientists are doing is to benefit all people. I've talked to people, it's done me, I trained as a scientist, I am a scientist, so I think is a huge issue. It has to start right now. I mean, PGN is really focused on, we have a vision that in 5 years that we could go for comprehensive awareness within our nation, which we think is really fundamentally on trust and confidence. But it needs funding. I mean, it needs a lot of funding because a lot of it, one-on-one interactions on the ground, and this is to your point as well, there's no substitution for it. We're working with Hollywood writers and producers. There is the capacity to reach mass audiences, and different audiences watch different movies, and so we have to be well aware of that. But I think in the end, it has to be efforts where you really get to know the communities, you hear the communities, and people from the communities who are having these conversations for building trust. In terms of affordability, if the price of genome sequencing is any indication, where that $1,000 genome is available. Illumina announced a week or so ago that they're going for the $100 genome. I know I have many colleagues who they will not rest until it is really less than $1 pennies because that's where we have to go, or we will fail in being able to make this available to a broad cross-section of society who wants it. And I'm just going to stop there and I apologize for listening.
So I'll just try to keep it brief. I'll make a comment on 2 things. So one is on the fundamental capacities. So here, I'm a philosopher, and the philosophers think that this is a normative question. So it's something that we have to settle through some sort of reflective equilibrium, where you use a mixture of your intuitions versus, and then you try to test your intuitions against the real world. So I'll just give you an example. If I tell you that, one of the fundamental capacities is to be able to sail a yacht, right? Like it's my fundamental capacity to be able to sail a yacht. So I have a right to sail a yacht. So you got to give me resources so I can sail a yacht. You would think, no, you don't have that right, right? How do we figure that out? It's through some sort of intuitive judgment about the matter. If I say, but I have a fundamental capacity to be able to have deep personal relationships with my children, with my family, you start to think, maybe that sounds like in the ballpark of something in the fundamental capacity. So we got clear cases of not fundamental capacity, clear cases of fundamental capacity. And there's going to be stuff in between. And that's where we need to have ethical arguments to, sort of analyze, to figure out whether that thing that we're talking about is more on this side or is more on that side. On the question of consent, I think, this is going to be one of the big issues about, getting people to give up genomic information. I actually think it's going to be really easy to do it. And here's how it's going to be done. It's basically the freemium model, right? So now, all of us, how many people have Google Gmail accounts here? Show of hands. Well, exactly. And Google is sort of using all that information. It's collecting so much information from you because it's giving you a free Gmail account, right? And you freely consented to giving up that information, and now they're making, it's like $1 billion, I don't even know how much money Google has now, but and it's going to be the same thing with genomic information. Some company's going to come out and say, look, we'll give you this for free. You can share your genomic information, and then we'll give you data. So there's going to be sort of freely available data where you can kind of check about sort of your likelihood of getting certain disease versus not. And then there's going to be a premium model, right? The premium model is like, we're going to give you very nice genetic counselors. We're going to be able to talk you through your, et cetera, right? That's how it's going to go, and everybody will sign up. But I do think, but saying that, I do worry about being, issues about discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why I do think that going forward, we need a robust normative framework. And that's where I latch on to this human rights stuff, because I think that by having a robust human rights, we say that we can't discriminate against people, use genetic information against them in terms of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to make sure that whatever we do, they have basic health care and things like that. So, but that's a normative position, and whether you agree with it or not, but that's where I think we need to go. So.
Okay, I will, first of all, somebody made a point about displacement of industries and sectors. I think we all know that played a major role in the most recent collection. And that was like 20 years ago automation, right? Now we've got AI, which is going to displace the service industry. We have an entire set of companies working on this thing called cellular-based agriculture. If you haven't looked into it, you should. It's this idea that, hey, we can grow meats and things in the lab. And isn't it great for the environment? Because we know animals cause lots of environmental damage. Well, I'm sure that the senators from Wyoming and Texas would not be thrilled to know that there is a vision to get rid of ranching, right? The same thing that happened to the coal industry, you could imagine. What are you going to do with all of those people? So it's incumbent, and I have had those companies come in and talk to me in the White House, and when I ask them that question, they say, Okay, so it's important to think about the other effects that you have. I think one point I'd like to make, just to hit again on the fact that we live in this digital world. I don't know if you all noticed, but for the first time ever last year, we had a month where all 5 of the companies at the top of the Dow Jones were digital companies. I mean, that's mind-blowing, right? There were no oil companies, there were no manufacturing companies, it was all digital. Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft. They're all still in the top 10. And then finally, and this is one that we do not talk enough about when we have to, with the intersection of national security and the life sciences. Okay, so the question was a little bit off, but I will answer a question that wasn't asked. Who has the biggest genome sequencing center in the world? China. Who has the fastest supercomputer in the world? China. Okay? If you think that doesn't scare the living blank out of a lot of people with top secret clearances in Washington, D.C., you're crazy. Okay? And those people don't have life science backgrounds, right? How many life scientists do you think have top secret clearance? How many people with top secret clearance do you think are comfortable talking to life scientists in a non-top secret setting? Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem? or at the very
There's a movement for that now.
I think there's actually a faster solution to that, which is I think the life science community and the national security community need to start talking to each other. If you look at DoD, they have a history of physicists at leadership levels. In fact, Ash Carter is a physicist. Bernie Moniz, the Department of Energy has a huge national security apparatus. He is a physicist. Life scientists engaging with the national security community. And I know it scares you all, but it's going to be important.
One point, please. Thank you. What you're discussing is the essential competitive nature of human beings. You mentioned China as a country that's investing a lot of time and talent in these technologies. And that's essentially all the moral and ethical issues that we're dealing with. We're essentially dealing ultimately in this world with highly competitive human beings, and they generally don't share with us. That's the bottom line. And it happens on an individual basis, it happens on a community basis, it happens on an international basis. If I may respectfully suggest, one of the things that we faced, obviously, with the unleashing of nuclear energy is its proliferation and control. We do have the International Atomic Energy Commission and the agency. What you guys are doing is so important. I can't overemphasize this enough. This has to go international. People around the world have to be discussing these issues because ultimately these technologies can be the bases of very serious problems for entire humanity. And human nature is such. We're an iterative species. We make mistakes. We can't afford to make mistakes with this.
Yeah.
This could be very bad.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'll make just a few points. First, on jobs, I completely agree about this disruption. I was at a party last week, and there was a woman who was there who was a radiologist. And I said to her, I said, how long do you think it will be before artificial intelligence can do the majority? Our first question was, how much of your job is pattern recognition? And then 2 was, how long do you think it will be before artificial intelligence can do pattern recognition on your set of issues? They will get better than you. And I talked about AlphaGo, and she said, oh no, they'll never be able to. And I said, can we bet? And we bet an ice cream cone that in 10 years. So I think that this level of disruption across so much of what we do. It's nice to hear you're writers and poets and philosophers. I think we've got a little bit of a lease on life. With regard to China, I agree. My Genesis Code, my most recent novel, is about a U.S.-China competition around human genetic engineering, and that stuff is happening. It's very real, and these competitive pressures, both within societies and between societies, are going to drive us forward. And it's the history of our species. That's how we evolve. Comprehensive awareness is great, but we have comprehensive awareness now of Ebola, and it's kind of bad comprehensive awareness. So our goal is good comprehensive awareness. It doesn't happen because there's some crisis, because like a chimeric pigman is born and people freak out, but because we're really thoughtful about it, which comes back to this question about scientists getting involved in politics. Just this week, there's a new movement launch called 314, which is about getting scientists to run for office. So everybody here should run for office. And then finally, on the international issue, that's really critical. I've been talking to the office of the incoming UN Secretary General about what they can do. But I think really this conversation, parts that are happening in different places, scientists are actually doing a great job, but it's about the issue is bringing everybody in together. So we're going to go, so we have just about 5 or 6 more minutes left in our allotted time. 2 more minutes. 2 minutes or 2 questions? 2 questions. And so make this one, you get 1 sentence.
Okay.
Use it wisely.
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm over at Cornell.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's a philosophical question, so I'll try to be very brief. The framework that you proposed for these fundamental capabilities seems to rest very much on inaction, being ethically neutral, so to speak. So you can't make a human that has these diseases that takes away their fundamental capacities, but you're free to give birth to one if it naturally occurs. However, when does your obligation to help this person step in? If you have the capability of fixing the disease in the embryonic state, why are you not obligated to do that if you're obligated, once they're babies and children, to treat that disease? I mean, there are plenty of cases where CYS is going to take away kids for, inadequate medical treatment.
Just for the record, let us say that in between each one of those things was a comma. Sorry.
German-style run-on sentence.
Yes. Great. Okay, good. All right, so we have I promised that everyone would be able to be heard, and I think there are people who haven't been heard. So some of us at least, will stick around. So if you have something that you'd like to share, please come and share it with us. And so the last comment, and then we'll just have this very, very quickly. Any final thoughts here?
A quick comment. The answer to the radiologist question is about 6 years ago. There was a study that was looking at the differences between a computer looking at radiographs and a human radiologist looking at a radiograph, and it is an incredibly stark difference. Look it up. It is particularly interesting.
All right, so final thoughts, and then again, we will stick around because what you are thinking and what you're saying is as or more valid than what we are thinking and we're saying. We really want to hear. So why don't we start? Matthew, you can take it first this time.
Okay, so just on that, I totally agree. I only sketched a bare sketch of the account, but so I mentioned 2 conditions. There were actually 4, one of which is this, where we do have an obligation, if we can, to correct genetic defects, if we can. So I think that if it was really easy, say you can just use CRISPR, someone had, cystic fibrosis or whatever, and you can fix it, you should totally do it. So.
Good.
Okay. International, yes. I think it's good awareness and good information, yes. And I'll just say, I think that this is such an exciting time that we're in. I'm just going to kind of give my more concluding remarks. Is that it's such an exciting time in the sciences, and we're kind of in this transition point where, maybe it's 20 years, 50 years, we're looking back, and this, whatever it is, will maybe be more a part of routine life. Might be the vision that you laid out, it might be something completely different. Our goal is that we look back and that we're proud of how we handled it. We handled it responsibly. I think it's really doable to get there, and I'm really inspired by this generation of scientists that's coming up, trainees, that they're really engaged in all of these conversations. So that makes me very optimistic.
Robbie?
I have nothing to add other than thanks everyone for being here.
Okay, well, wait, no, don't clap. First is, this is an ongoing conversation. All of you, as I said, are empowered. You are the actors. Congressman Bill Foster is also participating in this conversation. He had sent us some questions in advance about how do we think about a regulatory framework, how do we think about avoiding a race to the bottom. Everybody very rightly has recognized how challenging these questions are, and how we have to bring the best of our aspirational selves to really figuring out how we navigate. And we are all the actors, and I hope everybody is informed and empowered by this dialogue, so we can all take this out into the world and keep this conversation going. So thank you all so much.
So I just wanted to say very quickly, as you know, we've recorded the whole thing, so if you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, it's on our Facebook page. The second thing is, now you know who we are. If you're interested in getting involved with CPAC, please come and talk to us now or when you see us around campus. And the third thing is, I think the work that the speakers have done has been incredible, and I think that your input has been invaluable. This has been a great discussion. So we, the CPAC team, wanted to thank all of you for all your contributions. Thank you so much.